Wait a second. So 54 years later, after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, they're still not releasing all the files? Do not be misled by this word addresses. Nobody is or was asking for any addresses. All you have to do is look at the details, which is that the FBI, the CIA, and other unnamed agencies, let me guess, the NSA, deemed that this information was sensitive to national security. So the question becomes, who on earth are they protecting? Whose identity? Never mind the addresses. 54 years later, do you want to know whose name is in there? I guarantee it. George H.W. Bush. That's right, former president and former CIA director, who's already been linked years ago through a declassified document that shows that he was involved in the investigation of JFK, which of course he denied and said that it must be a different George Bush. And years later, when questioned about it again, he refused to comment on it entirely. And although George H.W. Bush would become the director of the CIA 13 years after the death of JFK, at the time of JFK's death, he was indeed a top-level CIA agent. In fact, even briefing President Dwight Eisenhower, who of course was the president before JFK. So when you take into account that he's already been linked to the investigation, that he was a top official, which obviously anyone investigating the death or homicide, the assassination of a sitting president, would be assigned to top-level officials, which he was. He denied it, and here we are 54 years later, and the CIA, the FBI, and other agencies consider it critical to national security. This in itself is a complete admission of a cover-up. Think about it. Someone who was a president and the director of the CIA would have incredible knowledge and information that the general public would not have. And for some reason, they still don't want the general public to have all the information. If you're not aware, George H.W. Bush's health is rapidly deteriorating. If you haven't heard, there are rumors going around that his mind is going, that he has become senile, he's saying weird things, and he's not completely coherent. So considering the fact that he was the director of the CIA, just imagine what he knows, even more things than presidents know. And he's going senile. Isn't it possible that they're afraid he might say something? I mean, just look at the unusual coincidence of the timing of the fact that they were going to withhold these names and addresses to the precise timing of these groping and sexual misconduct allegations made against them. Is it possible that the powers that be want to burden and stress the mind of an old man in order to prevent him from saying something related to the JFK incident? Or maybe it's a threat. Maybe they're afraid he might say something on his deathbed, knowing that he is rapidly deteriorating. Now, obviously, that's just conjecture and speculation on my behalf, but the powers that be have been indeed protecting the Bush family for far longer than most people are aware of. Take Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush and the grandfather of George W. and Jeb, which many people are not aware was a founding director of the Union Banking Corporation, which literally funded the United States and the Nazis during World War II. Literally funding both sides, which has to be the most sinister thing possible, so that way you win and make a fortune no matter who loses. And despite this being in violation of Trading with the Enemy Act, absolutely nothing happened to him, and less than 10 years later, he would become a United States Senator. But do not be fooled by these headlines that say he assisted Hitler's rise to power and make you think that, oh, maybe they gave him money and loaned him money in the 30s before World War II. No. They were doing business and funding the Nazis into October of 1942, 3 years after Hitler invaded Poland and started World War II. And he got off the hook completely. Gave birth to a child who would become a CIA director, a president, who would give birth to a child who would become president, whose other son was it's like seemingly the powers that be were trying to force him into the White House despite overwhelming public dissent and having no interest in Jeb Bush becoming the president. We all saw what happened there. Now, if you're wondering what this has to do with the JFK's death, I'm priming your brain for the information that you're about to get. Never mind all the conspiracy theories, as they've been called, involving the grassy knoll, the fence, the storm drain, and various theories on who a second gunman could have been, because all those things are debatable. Look at the evidence that we do know, which is positive that there was a cover-up. Take, for example, the so-called stretcher bullet that was found on the gurney of Governor Connally, which of course was injured in the assassination event of JFK. This bullet went through 2 people, a neck, and 2 bones, and somehow was miraculously untouched. And when you compare the same bullet to other bullets found in this event, you can see the dramatic difference. And if you're not familiar with ballistics, Well, bullets are made of lead, which is very malleable, and even when you shoot them into water, look at the incredible damage. And they want us to believe that somehow this bullet was found on a stretcher with zero damage and zero blood on it at all. In other words, somebody planted it who had access to that hospital. And we know now that George H.W. Bush was involved in this investigation and denied it. A top-level CIA agent. So this is the part where a lot of people, even though approximately 7 out of 10 Americans is convinced of a cover-up and a second gunman, many other people don't buy into it because they're like, well, why would the government kill their own president? They just don't think it's possible. So let me get into that and start off by showing you what Dwight Eisenhower, the president right before JFK, his very last speech before leaving the White House was literally about outing the military-industrial complex, that various powers that are able to remain anonymous in the intelligence community were able to seize power that far exceeded the Constitution and the powers of the presidency. That was his very last speech before leaving the White House. Yet most people are completely unaware that JFK made a speech just 3 months into his presidency. Just 3 months, not even, after Dwight Eisenhower's speech. And in the speech, he discusses secret societies and the very grave danger and ambitions for those who want increased security. And this ties right into the reason or a motive, a significant motive of why the powers that be in the intelligence communities or the military-industrial complex would want to kill JFK. Take, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis. All the intelligence officials and chief of staffs wanted to launch and go straight to war with Cuba. JFK did not go along with it. He showed restraint and he made the right decision. And this is the part where it gets really disturbing. Declassified documents that most people are completely unaware of prove that the United States government conspired to commit a false flag attack to blame on Cuba in order to implement a full-fledged invasion of the country. They even discussed blowing up a drone airliner and faking it to look like the Cubans had shot it down. They discussed blowing up a warship inside Guantanamo Bay. They discussed lobbing mortars into Guantanamo Bay's base itself and blaming it all on the Cubans. And they even outlined how they could utilize the casualty list in newspapers to grow indignation from the American public to support this war. And you can press pause and look at the other tactics that they were investigating. This is real. And just look at the date on that. Less than a year after JFK said it would happen. So here's the part you really need to know. JFK's signature was the only one left that was required in order to implement this plan. He refused. So the second most likely reason involves Vietnam. Although JFK did send troops, and at the time of his death, there was approximately 16,000, he refused to do a full-fledged invasion like the powers that be wanted to. And you can see here, JFK died towards the end of 1963, and just over a year later, that number would grow exponentially and even more in the years following. But what 99% of Americans, I would venture to say, have no idea is that it has been proven through declassified documents, verified by a report from the NSA, that the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which involved an attack on U.S. warships from the North Vietnamese, was completely a staged false flag event that did not happen. And they utilized it as an excuse for Congress to vote for war on the resolution to completely invade that country. And that happened in August of 1964, less than 11 months after the assassination of JFK, the president who refused to fully invade Vietnam. This is real. This is verifiable. Yes, the United States government's excuse for invading Vietnam was made up. And all the documents prove this. And 99% of the public has no idea. And it gets even worse. Did you know that Richard Nixon, it's been proven decades later, and although LBJ thought this the entire time and the American public was completely unaware, that Richard Nixon, in his quest to become president, literally spent money and bribed various Vietnamese officials in order to postpone the Paris peace talks, which would of course end the conflict, or war I should say, in Vietnam. All you ever hear about is Richard Nixon being tricky dick and Watergate, bugging the hotel rooms of his political opponents to get himself an advantage, when all this time it was known that he literally sabotaged the Paris peace talks in order so he could get credit when he became president for ending the war and being like, look, I'm the hero. Meanwhile, more than 20,000 people were killed and who knows how many injured while those peace talks were delayed. Just like I mentioned in the video prior to this one, where I say that the mainstream media is complicit in cover-ups and manipulation of information. Just look at the date that the New York Times covered this story. New Year's Eve, probably the least watched news day of the year, and people are the only thing they're watching is Times Square and the ball dropping. Do you see what I'm talking about here? The cover-up is real. The United States government plotted a false flag attack to go to Cuba. Unsuccessfully because JFK said no. JFK said no to a full-scale invasion. Less than a year later, they literally voted to go invade Vietnam based on a false flag attack that never happened, and they knew it. And this is 100% verifiable. Declassified documents prove this. 99%, again, like I say, probably, maybe 98, have no idea. The truth is stranger than fiction, guys. I'm not kidding when I say that. This is real. So when you consider that someone or multiple people are still alive that have some sort of information that's critical to national security is still being withheld 54 freaking years after the assassination of JFK, what does that tell you? When you look at the incredible coincidence of timing involving the George H.W. Bush groping allegations to this, when you consider the fact that he is obviously a person of incredible knowledge and information that the general public does not have just from being a CIA agent and president, and that his mind is going, and you start connecting the dots on all these possibilities, it becomes abundantly clear that this guy is somebody that knows far more about the death of JFK than the American public. So why on earth is this a national security issue? Well, let's see. If the American public found out that a former president and CIA director was involved somehow, in some way, in the death or cover-up of JFK, there's your national security concern, because we already know that the various powers that be have been protecting this family far longer than most people watching this have even been alive. Guys, the truth is stranger than fiction. If you support my ambitions to expose truth, like, subscribe, and leave a comment. All those things will boost the algorithms on this video. And I also have a Patreon account. Help support me in my quest to expose the truth and awaken the masses in whatever the best ways that I can. But I'll wrap up there. I'm Jimmy. This is Bright Insight. Take care, everybody.